in the not killing people with slides. I have a few slides that I will just give to Mike, and the main point of these slides for people is there are a couple of URLs, and the URLs are very long. So when he posts the slides, you can see them. I will reference them in my discussion this morning, but they will be available if you need them. And what I said, my focus on is what's next. I mean, we've had such an incredible, roughly 2 years of people moving forward on the smart grid and considering what it is. Now what do we do? And I like to start, there's a quote, President Obama, when he first took office, did a 60-day cyber review of all of the various programs and initiatives. And to me, this was really the first inclination that our administration and really senior administrative officials were definitely looking at the critical infrastructures and the smart grid. And one of the statements in this cyberspace policy review, as the United States deploys new smart grid technology, the federal government must ensure that security standards are developed and adopted to avoid creating unexpected opportunities for adversaries to penetrate these systems or conduct large-scale attacks. And for those of us who've been in the cybersecurity arena for any period of time, it was very nice to see that, again, our administration is really looking at these critical infrastructures and acknowledging that it's important to ensure the cybersecurity. We've heard a lot over the last day about some of the issues with the smart grid, some of the potential problems we can have. But on the other side of this, there is a tremendous opportunity for everybody. There is such an opportunity in this modernization to improve the security of the grid. There are a lot of technologies and tools out there, and if you look at some of the devices that are already deployed in the existing grid, some of the devices, they're analog devices, some of them are very old, and as we move to digital technology, there are some challenges there, but also there's tremendous opportunity. Including the IT and the telecommunications in this environment also brings opportunities and potential vulnerabilities, but we can use the tools and techniques that those two sectors have developed and deployed to work in the smart grid environment. And people have been talking about this, and again, this is very nice to hear that the architecture security must be built in, not just bolted on. And I was having breakfast with a couple of people, and they said, well, this is the internet of the electric sector. And I said, please don't say that. I always cringe when I hear that. The internet, when it was designed, it was never intended to have security in it. It was a research tool. And for the smart grid, we want to build security in from the very beginning and not just add it on as an afterthought. It's critically important to have security in it. Most of you have heard of the Energy Independence and Security Act, and there are two specific areas in Section 13 that are particularly important. One is for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and their mandate from the ESA legislation was to coordinate the development of a framework that includes protocols and modern standards for information management and to achieve interoperability of smart grid devices and systems. The second one is for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and their requirement was at any time after NIST has reached sufficient consensus in FERC's judgment, FERC shall institute a rulemaking proceeding to adopt such standards and protocols as may be necessary to ensure interstate transmission of electric power, to ensure the functionality and interoperability in interstate transmission of electric power and regional and wholesale electricity markets. As most of you know, FERC's responsibility is the bulk power system. It is not distribution, and so they're focusing on that area. One of the changes is that this ESA legislation really has defined new roles for both NIST and FERC. As was mentioned previously in discussions yesterday, NIST, in its former lifetime as the National Bureau of Standards, developed standards primarily for the federal government, but they also coordinated with the private sector. NIST, in its current role, there is only one area where NIST develops standards, and that is cybersecurity. Those standards are only applicable to the federal government. NIST works with other standards bodies and the international standards bodies and promotes the adoption of these standards, but they only focus on cybersecurity for the federal government specifically. So for NIST to be given this mandate in the legislation to come up with an interoperability framework and to identify these standards, this really is a new role. FERC's focus, and you know they coordinate with NERC on the development of standards for the bulk power system. This whole area of what they do under the ESA legislation and adopting these various standards is a new role. And I'll say this probably several times in my talk. And some of you, if you listened on the FERC technical conference on January 31st, that word adopt. It does not have enforcement authority behind it. And so what does that mean? What does that mean for FERC? What does that mean for state regulators? What does that mean for asset owners and operators? That term is not defined. And there still are many questions as what does that mean? Now, the other side of that is what is the perception? And if you look at the standards that NIST posted, if you look at our NISTer document, regardless of the word, these are optional, these are guidance. People are seeing them as mandatory. And a couple people commented yesterday that they're seeing the NISTer referenced in RFPs that you must comply with it, which I don't know how you do that because it's a guidance document. So the perception is that these are mandatory documents. And I have heard from some utilities that they are seeing, particularly the 5 families of standards posted by FERC, as you must implement these standards. So we need to look at this, and again, I'm wearing sort of at this point, my Washington hat, and the perception out there is even if these standards were not specifically adopted by FERC, please pay attention to them because organizations are looking at them. The NIST interagency report, and several people commented on that yesterday, and a number of people who are attending this conference participated in the working groups. That NIST document, and I will be totally selfish about this, I think it was a fabulous effort. It was a fabulous group of individuals who worked on it, and the idea was to put together a guidance document. It is a very high-level document of requirements. It has a risk assessment process. The document is long. If you've seen it, it's close to 600 pages. There are 3 main sections of the document. The first one is the requirements and architecture, and the architecture is a logical architecture. The document was not intended to be prescriptive, and that's critically important as organizations are doing their innovation. The second volume is privacy, and I want to focus on that a little bit because we've been talking about cybersecurity primarily at this conference, but privacy is a significant component of the smart grid, and particularly for the consumer and the homeowner, they are concerned about privacy when they hear that utilities will be collecting their usage data every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, as opposed to once a day or once a month. They are concerned about their personal information, how that is going to be used, who has access to it. As I discovered from the privacy working group, who owns your usage data depends on the state you live in. That surprised me. I thought, gee, that's my data. But it depends on the state you live in. And as we move forward on the smart grid and you look at an interconnected grid where an organization, if you use a third party that helps you manage your energy usage, if they're in one state and you live in another state, and say the data is in a cloud in another country, who owns that data? Who ensures the integrity of data? These are questions that everybody is grappling with right now. State PUCs, and another point I want to make that I will say again in talking to some people, to me what we should be focusing on in the smart grid perspective is really the delta, the differences from the existing grid. There are a lot of different technologies, a lot of requirements that are met in the existing grid to address reliability and privacy. What's new with the smart grid? We now have two-way flow of communications, two-way flow of data. What are the differences? And to me, privacy, this is a particularly important area because people get very concerned and say, well, gee, the utility is going to have all my usage data. What are they going to do with that? Utilities have had that data for decades and have been protecting it. I go to the grocery store and the checker bags my stuff and says, thank you, Mrs. Lee. Yes, people do know where I go. If you go on a trip and use your credit card when you buy gas, people can see where you've been, where you're going. So it's important to focus on what's new with the smart grid. And particularly with the personal information and usage data, it's the amount of data that will be collected or potentially can be collected in the future that to me is the major difference. You can have, people talked about terabytes and petabytes of data that will be collected. How is that being protected? Who has access to it? How long will that data be maintained? If there's an issue, how do I ensure the confidentiality and integrity of that information? And then if there is an incident, how does law enforcement get involved? Again, all of these issues have been addressed to a certain extent for the existing grid. It's just as we move forward in the future, what do we need to consider that's different from the current environment, current technology that we need to look at? And in this country, if you look at other countries where they may have one utility, and I know there was one country that we were looking at one point I was looking at their system, they had 2 SCADA systems, that was it. Thinking, gee, that would be nice. We have the separation of states and the federal government. How are the different regulatory bodies going to work together? You have FERC that addresses the bulk power system, and the states and their PUCs that really focus on distribution down to the home. How are these organizations going to work together in the future? People recognize that this is a big issue, and you have a FERC-NARUC collaborative that is coordinating this, and you heard people say yesterday, I will reiterate, it's very important to get involved. Participate in all of the working groups. One thing that we are starting to look at EPRI, because there's so many different groups, and some of them were discussed yesterday, is just coming up with a list of what's going on in all the different groups so people can see there's plenty of work to do. But again, the regulatory organizations are also looking at these issues and saying, how do we coordinate to ensure that there is a smart grid? In our discussions on the cybersecurity working group, we had one of the telecons where somebody said, you know, I'm just not worried about that. I'm this little utility. I have a few customers. Do I really need to be that concerned about privacy and cybersecurity? Why would anybody attack my system? Somebody else on the phone call said, thank you very much. I will use you as my entrance point to attack a larger utility or another critical infrastructure. And I think that is really the important thing you need to consider when we interconnect all of these organizations, that potentially you could use a small one as an avenue to attack a larger system. There was a technical conference held on January 31st at FERC. And again, this was in direct response to the ESA legislation. NIST posted 5 families of standards. FERC held a technical conference. They had 2 panels. How many people listened in on the tech conference? Okay, a number of people here did. Good. And so they had 2 panels, and each one gave their perception and their viewpoint on the process for selecting these 5 families of standards, and then the process moving forward. At the completion of each of the panels, Chairman Wellinghoff asked, was there sufficient consensus to adopt the standards? All 13 panel members said there was not sufficient consensus for FERC to adopt the standards. Now, part of the comments that people made is what is sufficient consensus apply to? What does that mean? And again, the question, what does adopt mean? FERC now has a comment period. The initial time frame for submitting comments to FERC was March 2nd. They have extended that to March 9th. And then there will be a second comment period for all comments that are posted by March 9th. People have till March 23rd to provide a second round of comments. Please submit comments. FERC, in its role, makes its decision based on comments. I could give comments when I was there. Jason, who's in the back, he also could provide technical comments, but the commissioners make the decisions based on comments that are submitted. So it really is important to provide your comments on what you think about was done. Some of the speakers even said, gee, I really didn't know the process. I really didn't know what was available to me. That is also important for them to hear. What's going to happen next? Once the comments are received, FERC will do an assessment of the comments, really from a policy and a technical perspective, and they spend a lot of time, do a very detailed technical analysis, and obviously depending on how many comments are received, can take a little longer, a little shorter, and then they will post the comments and post their resolution. At that point, and my opinion, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen next. There's still lots of questions about what does adoption mean and what does this mean for various regulators from a federal and a state perspective. It is, again, my opinion that it's not clear what FERC will do next and how this will move forward and what NIST will do next on these standards and any future standards. So please submit your comments. Part of the difficulty with this is that state regulators were really looking to FERC for guidance on, okay, if FERC adopts these various standards, then we will consider them. So this has left state regulators in a tough position. Part of the discussions yesterday, and this applies to state regulators in addition to small organizations, asset owners, and operators, is that they don't necessarily have a lot of technical expertise in cybersecurity, and so they were looking to FERC for guidance. So people get involved at this point. Like I say, how the way forward is going to be, I don't have a crystal ball. The ARA grants, the money is being spent. People are deploying products. As somebody said, at times it's like the ready, fire, aim approach to how we deploy tools and technologies in the smart grid. But cybersecurity really is being considered as a very critical component. And for me, I'm like Bill, I've been doing cybersecurity for more than a couple of decades. And initially when I started, people would look at me and say, yeah, we'll talk to you later. Bless you. This is one of the areas, the critical infrastructure, where people really are saying, we've got to get this right. We've got to get security built in from the beginning. And that's a very positive sign. It also is a tremendous responsibility. When we were putting the NIST together, and given the time frame that we developed it and the tremendous pressure that NIST was under, not only from our working group, but all of the working groups, tremendous pressure to get something done, get something posted, we miss things. We make mistakes. I mean, nobody is perfect in this, and that makes it very difficult when all the work that's being done is so public. And particularly in cybersecurity, we're going to miss things. Organizations are going to miss things. So we need to be very careful, but then also built into every system, how do you mitigate any issues that arise? How do you mitigate technical problems that you run into? And I think, and was discussed yesterday, it's really the whole change management and update process that eventually is far more expensive than the initial installation and implementation. Putting in place a process to address new problems, new vulnerabilities, are going to be new attacks, new technologies. You need to figure out how to address all of those. And in the electric sector, people commented yesterday, this is a little different where typically, and this is true not only the electric sector, but most of the critical infrastructures, the approach has been, let's put it out there. If it works fine, I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to leave it. If it works fine, I'm just going to leave it alone. When you overlay the IT and communications infrastructure, it's a very different environment. Their time frame for change, time frame for update is months, maximum, typically a couple of years. That's a very different environment, and it really is a clash of cultures, as people have said, clash of how you do your work, how you move forward, and we have to figure out how to put all of these together in one group. Again, I don't have any bright answers on all of this. At this point, I'm just going to open it up. If there are any questions, comments, feedback, please. Darren, sit down.
Kept waiting yesterday, and I kept winding up on the wrong end of the timer. So so I figured I'd go ahead and step up and actually say, first off, Annabelle, thank you very much for the comments. Sincerely appreciate them, and I think that's some valuable insight and some words we should take to heart. One thing that this is more of a comment, certainly open to pushback or feedback or perspective on how you think this fits in, but I feel like by and large our industry has made a significant step from security was number 11 on the top 10 list. Yeah. To, yes, we are a top consideration now, but I think we still are falling shy on one key point, and it's more of a philosophical thing in the industry, which is that and this comes down to was really echoed a lot in Travis's presentation yesterday. I don't know how many, is Travis here again today? I guess it's way too early for Travis. Yeah.
He was up late drinking.
But the core message is that with new functionality comes new risks and responsibility. And we have, especially the smart grid is just completely emblematic of it, but typically we have gone about this as discovering some new functionality, and the opportunists and entrepreneurs among us, immediately take it and run with it. Can't say that I blame them. There's great opportunity there, but somehow or another we have to start pushing on this cultural shift to say, okay, we add some new functionality into the picture. We've got to figure out what's the downside to that functionality or the risk to that functionality as well as the benefit. So to put this kind of in a question format, what do you think might be the most effective way for us to communicate that to the policy level and get the folks that are leading, that are leading and guiding and setting the rules for our entire country here? How do we get them to embrace that concept and by setting the framework for our operations here, encourage the rest of the community to do the same?
Yeah, let me answer that a couple of ways. And just looking at the news this morning, Apple is rolling out its new iPad this morning. So when you talk about, I've got the old one and I'm thinking, gee, I wonder what's new in the iPad world. Technology's neat. It's fun. It's fun to say this is the latest and greatest. And I'm glad you asked that question, because another point, again, talking to somebody yesterday, when you look at the risks and so on, and people were mentioning some of the issues with the new technology, IT and communication sectors are not immune to exactly the same problems that we are facing in the electric sector. How many default passwords are still out there on systems? How many people have privileges that they shouldn't have? This is not unique to the electric sector. A lot of the issues are common across all of the critical infrastructures. If you look at some devices and some manufacturers, they have default passwords posted on their websites, and how many of them are not changed. So it is, I believe it's more of a culture change for the electric sector, and I will put all the critical infrastructures, but it's still an issue with IT and communications. I don't know how many passwords right now, excuse me, I don't have photographic memory. I have to put them down somewhere. I mean, that is not a good security practice, but that's the reality of it. As far as how we move forward, again, I have no easy answer on that. I think that utilities need to, and people raised this yesterday on the one panel, utilities really need to question when vendors come in and say, I have this great technology, this new approach, to say, okay, what is it? What additional benefits is it providing me? But then also asking, what are the risks that I'm going to face if I'm installing this in new equipment? I think working with the state regulators and talking about what the new risks, the new technologies are going to provide. I think we need that dialogue, and I know people cringe. It's like saying, well, gee, let's just go talk to the IRS and ask them a question about your return. I don't want to do that either, you know, but you need to figure out how to do that so that organizations, and particularly regulators, don't mandate certain requirements and functionality that just really isn't reasonable. And they do need guidance from people, from the utilities and really the entire electric sector community to figure out what are the best tools. Part of it also is what is visible. If you look at newspaper articles and what is the most common part of the smart grid everybody reads about, meters. I mean, that's the end node. Yes, that's very important. That is not all the smart grid, but that's what you read about in newspapers. And I'm from California, so I figure I can say this. There are a couple of counties in California that have stopped deployment of smart meters for emanations, even though if they looked at the studies, the emanations is not significant. Some states are looking at it from a privacy. And so those get the headlines. It's providing the information that the regulators need, and I would say even some of the utilities to push back on vendors and implementers to say, okay, wait a minute, what functionality, what are the risks I need to assume? No easy answer.
Well, thank you.
I think we got one more. Time for one more quick, or you want to go?
A quick one, because
Yeah.
we're running a little behind, so.
Annabelle, I guess if you could revisit maybe the rulemaking thing, and I thought to the people in here that testified to FERC, it was great that that was out there. But I guess the short question is, can you, maybe just provide your opinion? Do you think a bad rule is worse than no rule in this kind of case?
Yeah, this is what I say. Oh, shoot, sorry, done, got to sit down. Yeah, obviously to me a bad rule is at times more dangerous than, no rule at all. I think the difficulty is, and what I don't want people to walk away with is the message that, well, they couldn't decide upon these standards, so security isn't important. I mean, and I do have some concerns about that people say, oh, it couldn't be that big a deal if they couldn't make up their minds, and still people are deploying all of this new technology and tools, so it's not that big a deal. It is a big deal. Part of the discussion too, and a number of people here participated and made presentations, was you also don't want to stifle innovation. And again, when I said this is a new role for NIST and FERC, this is really different than what they've done before. How do you ensure that if you adopt a standard that you don't stifle innovation? And reality is, when organizations are audited by, say, the state or by NERC, if they don't have the technical expertise, they're going to go down the list and say, all right, did you comply with? And if you say no, but, then you have the issue of, wait a minute, I don't want to hear any buts, did you comply with? And so trying to figure out how to work within a standards framework, which clearly is necessary for interoperability and functionality, but also allowing for innovation. These international standards, if you look at them, the update cycle, typically 3 to 5 years, then an update can take 3 years. The U.S. is only one representative on these international standards bodies, and It can say, gee, we need to do this quickly, and the other organizations, you know, the other national bodies can say, excuse me, you're one vote. So an update cycle can take 5 to 8 years if you look at the whole life cycle. How do we work within that framework and allow, you know, having these standards, but then allowing for innovation? I think I have more questions than I have answers for you.
And you'll all get a chance to ask Annabelle
I'll
questions.
still be here. Yeah.
Just walk up to her. She's a very friendly person. Thank you very much, Annabelle.